to All Things Green. I'm Anton, and today I'm joined by a very special guest. Justin Nobel is an award-winning environmental journalist and author of Petroleum 238, a book that was published in April about the oil industry's radioactive secrets and the grassroots fight to stop them. Justin, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Anton.
So, a 7-year investigation that started with a Rolling Stones article. Can you tell us a little bit about the radioactive secret of the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing listeners have to realize is a lot more comes to the surface at an oil and gas well than just the oil and gas.
Yeah.
Right now, many people may think of natural gas, what heats their stove, cooks their food. They might think of oil, they might think of what runs their car, or they might think of climate emissions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Carbon dioxide, methane. But you look at a well, and there's actually an entirely different thing coming to the surface,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the waste that comes up from deep underground. It is often natural materials from coming up within the earth, but they can have extraordinarily toxic properties. And I just want to go through a quick little volume lesson, as I often do in my talks. So the primary waste stream of the oil and gas industry is a really salty, toxic liquid that they refer to as brine, or produced
Mm-hmm.
water. Now, brine, produced water, does have toxic levels of salt. It can be 10 times saltier than the ocean. It contains elevated levels of heavy metals like lead and arsenic, and it can contain quite elevated levels of the radioactive heavy metal radium, which is a well-known human carcinogen. It's referred to as a bone seeker. That means when radium is accidentally inhaled or ingested, it accumulates in your bones, which is a terrible place for a radioactive element to be.
Mm-hmm.
So how much brine is produced across the U.S.? Every day, about 3 billion gallons.
Mm-hmm.
That's 1 trillion gallons a year. A trillion gallons of oil-filled wastewater, brine, brought to the surface in the U.S. each year. If you took that trillion gallons, Anton, and put it into your standard oil barrel, which is about waist high, and you stack them atop one another, they would reach the moon and back almost 28 times.
That's an insane amount.
It is an insane amount. That's a good word for it. And and it's an amount also that we'll take that word and put behind it the word cost. It's an insane cost. To appropriately deal with that waste stream is legitimately insane. I mean, it's cost prohibitive. The industry could not, and has never been able to actually deal with that waste stream in an appropriate manner that does not threaten their own workers or the environment. So what they've done is taken shortcuts since day one. And day one was 1859, Titusville, Pennsylvania. So initially they just discharged this waste to unlined pits, to streams, to marshes. Now we have a new form of oil-field waste management, and that's called injection. And the book lays out a number of massive problems with the process of injection wells, or injecting this wastewater into the earth. The other thing the industry tries to do is to treat the waste, and we can get into some of the problems associated with that. But I think the real big picture takeaway is that oil-field waste, this is the real problem of the industry, and this has actually always been their problem. Not climate change, which is of course a problem, but this problem. This problem has gone entirely under the radar, and yet affects people in very important ways, especially in Ohio.
Well, let's dig into that. You call it the oil and gas industry's radioactive secret. It's kept a secret intentionally from how you write it in your books, right? And that's because we need people to do these dirty jobs. Can you talk a little bit about the workers and their exposure to this waste stream?
Right. So there's this really shadow world of oil field waste work. I think when a lot of people imagine an oil and gas worker, they have this kind of glossy marble man image, someone in West Texas on like a horse, and like they have a lasso, and they also do oil field work, and like they're smoking cigarettes, and like it's glamorous. I mean, that's the point. And we live in an oil and gas nation, and this is a part of our mystique. Like oil and gas is this gutsy, glamorous job that might be dangerous, and you get covered in oil, but it's good for the economy, and it's a manly thing to do. Now, this very much exists in the U.S., but there's an entirely other world of work. And that work too, by the way, has radiological dangers. But the other world of work is dealing with this waste. So we imagine the brine that I was just talking about. You look at a well and you'll see tanks. And I'm talking about an oil and gas well. You see tanks, and many people might imagine that's all oil. But no, many of those tanks will contain brine, produced water. This is the waste stream I'm talking about. And many wells produce more brine than they do oil or gas. It is a significant waste stream. So looking at the tank, looking at the well, you have these tanks, there's brine in them. Just like this wonderful cup of coffee you all have provided me with here, there is sediment in the coffee, right? And if you let it sit for long enough, you've got this little sludge on the bottom. Yeah. Same thing is happening in a brine tank. And the problem is brine has these really concerning heavy metals, and it has radium, this radioactive heavy metal, at really elevated levels. And I'll just give you a quick introduction to radium. Yeah. Well-known problem. And so EPA has some restrictions and some guidelines. At 5 picocuries per liter, EPA has a safe drinking water limit for radium. And you just have to remember the 5. More than 5, EPA says we do not want more than 5 in drinking water for radium. Now, above 60 picocuries per liter, EPA says we can actually define a liquid as radioactive. This is technically, according to EPA's own language, a radioactive liquid waste stream above 60 picocuries per liter. The brine of the Marcellus, according to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, a very official government source, radium levels can average 9,330 and be as high as 28,500. So we're talking about 5 drinking water limit. 60, that's the limit for saying radioactive waste. And here we are at 9,330.
Yeah, through the roof.
Through the roof, right. So even more radioactive than the brine is the sludge that accumulates at the bottom of those brine tanks or trucks. And again, you've got this sediment-filled liquid stream. So anywhere it's sitting for a little bit, it's going to produce a sludge. Right. Tens to hundreds of millions of tons of this sludge produced across the industry each year. It's too radioactive to go to a local landfill. Local landfills have radiation sensors. It will set them off. So again, industry is the main thing here is cost. We want to do things as cheaply as possible. The appropriate place to go would be to take all that massive amounts of radioactive oil-filled sludge to low-level radioactive waste disposal facilities. They are all located out west. There's not many of them. They're very expensive. Mm-hmm. There's a big one in the Utah desert. It's a huge cost. It's very expensive to ship things long distances, and it's even more expensive to ship heavy things like sludge long distances. Yeah. The industry does not want to pay that cost. So what they do is this horrendous process called down blending. Yeah. They will mix radioactive oil-filled sludge and other radioactive oil-filled waste streams with items like coal ash, lime, ground up corn cobs has been used in Ohio. These are readily available and relatively cheap things to get. And you mix it around with the radioactive oil-filled waste. You're not making the radioactivity disappear, but you're trying to lower the levels enough so you can then get that waste into a local landfill rather than paying the exorbitant costs of shipping it to where it should be going. Now, the problem, Anton, is that job of, quote, down blending is being done by workers who are not appropriately informed that there's radiation risk. They often don't even know they're dealing with radioactivity. They're not appropriately protected, meaning they're wearing just, what's called FRs, which is standard flame-resistant clothes. Just looks like jeans and like a Dickie shirt and hard hat, maybe gloves, boots. And then, as my book also conveys, there are some terrible schemes that have developed, including what was happening at this Austin Master Services facility in Martins Ferry, where they were relying
right here in Ohio.
Right here in Ohio, right on the Ohio River, a really nice community. I was just there, and they're relying on men who have just been released from prison. And this is important to help these people back into society. So you think, oh, it's great to give them jobs. Well, no, not these jobs. They're in a desperate situation. These men, many of them still have drug problems, and this facility was actually reaching out and relying on them, because they're in this desperate state, to take this super dangerous job of trying to shovel up radioactive oil-filled waste and not giving them protection and not giving them training. And then, according to the workers who I spoke to who work there, laid out in the story, treating them like a slave, treating them like shit, and just really one of the most inhumane and really evil things that I encountered in all of my reporting, taking these workers, relying on these workers. But the reasons, because I did a lot of reporting on this issue, and the reasons become very clear, and you really get a window into how this industry operates. they can look at a worker who maybe has a degree in engineering, who knows about OSHA and the EPA, and they can look at a worker who just got out of prison and is desperate for a job. And who will they hire? The person with the degree knows a lot about rules and laws, and they might start to say, I don't know about this process we're doing, and what's that over there? And
Yeah.
they'll ask questions. The desperate worker who just got out of prison will not ask questions, and so time and again, they will go with that worker. And as one worker says, and it puts it very bluntly, multiply that by 1,000, by 10,000, that's your oil and gas industry.
Yeah. Tell me about your methodology. I mean, building relationships with these workers to even, put maybe their job or all of that at risk, maybe hatred from other workers or from their community for speaking out. What's your methodology of building relationships and investigating all of these types of things over the course of 7 years?
Yeah, certainly, certainly. A lot of these workers are at risk. So even mentioning the word, say they read one of my articles and then have this question of, am I dealing with radioactive sludge? If they use that word, radioactivity, radiation, they may be fired before the end of that day. If they talk about unionizing, they'll definitely be fired before the end of the day. And again, you want the worker, if you're running these facilities, who does not ask questions.
Yeah.
You don't want the worker who's going to start doing their own research and say what's in this stuff. So they are at risk in speaking out. And the way I am led to these workers is often through really fantastic community groups who have done a lot within their communities to raise awareness on these issues. And there's a great one with the case of Austin Master, which is CORE, Concerned Ohio River Residents, Alex and Bev there, and I know there's other people involved with that group as well. But what they do and why it works, Anton, is very interesting. Sociologically. So they are raising an alarm in a relatively conservative oil and gas country community.
Mm-hmm.
And many people don't want to hear that and think they're crazy environmental activists. And they have been called that to their face. But the alarm is being raised nonetheless, and maybe they have an op-ed in the local paper, and maybe they publish things. And now when you have a worker who's doing a really terrible job and starts to realize that they are being deceived and that something isn't right, they actually want to get their message out. They want to reach out to someone who can hear their story,
Right.
An open ear. And they start to, and people ignore them, just like people ignore the environmental activists. But then they see that, here's this group that wrote about this facility in the local paper, and they are critical, and they have the courage to stand up and raise their voice
Yes.
against the grain of the popular culture. So that's that person with courage, that's who I'm going to reach out to. And that's often the pathway. The worker actually that I'm in touch with, they respect the environmental activists because they're the ones who have taken the time to do the research and care about this issue that everyone else is ignoring and not paying attention to. And so you get this kind of chain of courage that develops. The worker has the courage to speak out, and they reach out to the other people who have already courageously raised the alarm, which are the activists. And then sometimes it might take months or even years for the activist to get the worker to me. But because I have great relationships with many of these environmental groups right on the ground, I'm there to be able to receive this knowledge and these whistleblowers as they emerge. And that's a really important part of the reporting process.
I wanted to also circle back to injection wells. So many people that are environmentalists, people who care about climate change, people that care about waste streams into the environment, they would say, well, Justin, there's an EPA, there's an Ohio Department of Natural Resources that regulates this. We have injection wells. This waste isn't going anywhere except for deep into the ground. How is this exposing me?
Right.
Could you talk to these people and tell them about your findings about how these injection wells are working or maybe not working, and why we should be worried if there's two regulatory agencies working with injection wells?
Yeah, great question, Anton. So I will just say off the bat, there's no scientific merit behind the idea of injection wells. It's an absolute sham. But let's unpack that. I think if you went to a kindergarten class and described what's happening, we've got endless truckloads of fracking waste. They've got heavy metals, radioactivity. We also have flowback mixed in, which has some of the toxic chemicals used in the frack returned back to the surface. This all is being sent down an injection well. We don't even know what's in some of these chemicals. It's all being mixed together like this absolutely terrible cocktail and sent into the earth. Like, what do you kids, think of that?
Yeah.
They don't have to know any of the science. All you have to know is like the word earth, and you'll probably say, that sounds bad. That just doesn't seem right. And it doesn't. And it's this weird trick where the industry and the government has defined this process, underground injection control. It's almost like it was developed in like a lab to make you feel safe. Like, this is a safe thing, underground injection control. But it is not backed in science. So I was always critical of the process of injection wells and what the regulators could never explain to me. And I asked ODNR, Ohio Department of Natural Resources, this question repeatedly. What is happening to the waste down there? Is it leaking out? Can you give me a time span of if and when it's leaking out? Like, does it stay in its, quote, target zone of injection for 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? Can you confirm to me that it will forever eternity, be in the target zone of injection, which we know is absurd because the Earth's plates move around and, eventually the Earth will be destroyed by the expanding sun.
And not to mention, in the last 7 months, there's been 7 injection wells suspended by the chief of the
right.
Division
So
of Oil and Gas.
We're getting to that, but they can't answer, which is was an important early sign to me that they don't know how to scientifically explain this process. So let's see if there's science that actually lays out that some of the flaws of injection. And eventually, I was led to that science. So first, the important thing is. And I'll see if I can find this quote really quickly. But the first important thing is that the EPA actually does not believe in the process of injection. So I'm just reading you right now from the book. In October 1970, David Dominic, commissioner of the Federal Water Quality Administration, which in 2 months would become part of the brand new EPA, warned that injection was a short-term fix to be used with caution and, quote, only until better methods of disposal are developed. When EPA laid out its proposed policy on injection wells in 1974, they echoed these concerns, stating in an internal statement on the subject that EPA's, quote, policy considers waste disposal by deep well injection to be a temporary means of disposal. Should a more environmentally acceptable means of disposal become available, change to such technology would be required. So right there, you have the EPA who's regulating this program saying, we don't trust it, we don't think it's good, and we should change it as soon as possible. It's kind of like, it is. It's shoving it under the carpet. We don't have a better thing right now, so let's just put it under the carpet. And by the way, the injection wells came about in the time after the Clean Water Act, which prevented the dumping of toxic waste in rivers. Yeah. So we used to just rely on the ocean and chuck it in rivers. And then when we said we couldn't do that, which was a great thing to say, let's protect our oceans and rivers and lakes, and this literally, you can track the rise of injection overnight. That became the means of disposal, shoving it under the carpet. Later, then I was led to this amazing conference, and we've got the book right here. It's a hard one for listeners to find, but it's all there in my book, so you don't have to find it. Underground Waste Management and Environmental Implications. This was a 1971 conference between the Association of Petroleum Geologists, here's the beautiful golden seal, and the U.S. Geological Survey. And they discussed underground waste management, which is injection wells, and they just tore the thing apart limb from limb. Yeah. And provide some wonderful and very easy to understand science about why it can't work, why it won't work, and why it's going to lead to earthquakes, leaking, and even they described exactly where it's going to leak up, which is where it is leaking up, as you mentioned, in other straws that go down into the earth, such as another oil and gas well. So we have the waste leaking out, and it's popping back up in places where we have conduits down into the earth.
Or possibly, as the chief of ODNR's Division of Oil and Gas said, it's an imminent threat to public health as it is leaking into people's drinking water wells.
It absolutely is. Absolutely. And I give them credit for even saying that. But really what I think the rational response, once you realize that 1, 2, 3, and now we're going beyond 3 injection wells have been confirmed to be leaking fracking waste and coming back up at the surface, which is astonishing because they said this process was perfect and it would hold. I think the next step is, well, we need to shut every single one down while we study this and see how many are leaking.
Yeah.
Now, that would be appropriate. What would happen if we shut every single injection well down? By the way, across the country, there's 100 and 80,000 oil and gas wastewater injection wells. That's 14 for every Starbucks. If you shut them all down, which I do think would be the appropriate decision based on the fact that we know they're leaking now, the oil and gas industry would be crippled overnight because they'd have nowhere to dispose of their 28 barrels to the moons of brine. 96% of oil-filled wastewater goes to injection wells, and there's no science behind injection wells. So, we can stop this train at that alone. It's done.
Yeah. Justin, that's really heavy, and I wanted to go just a little bit further. In your book, you say that Pennsylvania has, 12 injection wells. West Virginia has around 50. Ohio has nearly 250 injection wells. Why is that? Why is it that Ohio is so prime for injection wells when Pennsylvania and West Virginia do their own fracturing, fracking, and oil?
Yeah. It's hard for me to answer that in full because the people who could answer that best haven't really spoken to me, which are the state agencies and the federal agencies. But we do know that Ohio controls their underground injection control system, whereas in other states like Pennsylvania, the EPA controls that system. And when EPA controls the system, it's a little bit stricter. When the state controls it, it's easier to buy a state legislature, which is what this industry, tries to do. It's and this is actually stated throughout the book in very, beautiful poetic ways. But the oil and gas industry realized early on with their waste that they could either do it right and clean it up and take care of it right, or they could buy legislatures. And it's much easier to buy legislatures. And so I think, it's passé now, but you can absolutely say with good backing that the Ohio legislature has been bought by this industry. And so it's much easier to cite an injection well here than other places. And we'll give you an example. I know you like tacos, Anton. So we can go to Taco Bell. We can go to Taco Bell in Cambridge.
Yeah.
And it's in a shopping plaza, and we got a Verizon store right across the way. And when we're done, we'll get the coffee at Starbucks right next door. Mm-hmm. And on the other edge of that shopping plaza, where kids are with their mothers, like going to to the dollar store, which is also there, and get balloons for the party, there's an injection well and an endless parade of fracking waste trucks coming in to dump their waste. So I mean, the idea that this, even in its current state, that the system has been regulated appropriately, it's like, really? And you put an injection well, which is, we now know, it's radioactive, by the EPA's own rules, radioactive fracking waste trucks coming into the shopping plaza. Great system, guys.
So Justin, I wanted to ask you, you're talking about in your book, bought legislators, you're talking about injection programs where 96% of this waste is going deep into the earth, not based in science. EPA doesn't necessarily believe in the injection well program. How do we climb out of this deep, dark hole? How do we move forward? What kind of silver lining and positive note can we glean from this?
Yeah, courageous and creative activism. So one thing we've been talking about doing, and this is there in the book as well, we didn't talk about it necessarily too much today, but how is this all possible? One big reason is that oil-filled waste, despite all the heavy metals, the carcinogens, the radioactivity, despite all that, technically by the letter of U.S. law, it is non-hazardous. And that goes back to a 1980 exemption called the Benson and Bevel Amendments exemption. Now, because it's non-hazardous, you could have massive amounts of radioactive sludge accumulating on workers' clothes, bodies, faces, and we've tested now some of this sludge, and it is wildly radioactive. But by the letter of U.S. law, it's non-hazardous. So again, you tell me, Anton, okay, the law says it's non-hazardous, but it's got a lot of radium in it, and it's dripping down this guy's face. By the laws of science, of course, that's very concerning, and it's quite hazardous. So another thing, because it's non-hazardous, I've learned in my reporting, and this is right in there in the book in a really fun chapter, that there's a company in Texas that is importing radioactive oil-filled waste from foreign countries. Mm-hmm. And this is a time, when people are very up in arms about borders in this country, and yet they are bringing radioactive oil-filled waste from other countries seamlessly across our borders. And the company doing that asked EPA if they could do this. They asked permission, and EPA said, oil-filled waste is not hazardous, so sure, you can import radioactive oil-filled waste from foreign countries. So our plan, getting back to your question, courageous and creative activism, I think we need to have a conference or a meeting, maybe a press event, at the state capitol, and we're going to bring in, fracking waste, radioactive fracking waste, and we'll try and do it as appropriately as we can because we know the hazards. And I don't know if we'd make, I don't know what they drink in the legislature, bottled water or probably boring things like that. But we'll try and make like a fun cocktail, maybe a radioactive mudslide,
Yeah.
with the brine, and we'll serve it up to them. I think that would be appropriate, and dare them to drink their non-hazardous,
And of
waste.
course they won't.
Some of them might.
You think so? I hope not.
The true believers.
That's hilarious.
But let's put them to because that's what you want. You got to bring the lack of science and absurdity of the regulations back to them in just as an absurd way, because that's what they've laid out for communities. So let them then face the choice. And see the absurdity up close, the Twilight Zone-esque-ness of this all. Yeah.
These policymakers working for Buckeye Environmental Network, we've tried to go and educate the House and Natural Resources Committee. And there's been some senators who just say, it doesn't matter about the injection wells. Oil and gas is national security. And that's the type of absurdity, me and Chief will talk about it. Chief, who I interviewed on another episode. These are the kinds of statements that are so short-sighted when we're talking about bringing radioactivity up from the earth and spreading it far and wide.
Yeah, it may be. Clearly, oil and gas is a big part of the economic picture of the U.S. right now, and there's national security implications as well. But then the question is well, okay, then you tell me how many children we're going to kill and how many mothers are going to have, miscarriages because of this, because these things have been documented. Childhood cancers, rates go up, miscarriages go up. So I just want a number from the national security people. Is it going to be 1,000 kids, 100? You have to kill 1 million kids with weird, unusual cancers to have that outweigh the national security risks?
And I think those are the questions that we need to be asking to have a healthy dialogue to move forward, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, speaking of activism and fun events and things like that, I wanted to also just mention that Buckeye Environmental Network is sponsoring an event coming up where you are going to be present, Frackstock, on June 2nd at the Universalist Unitarian Church in Columbus. I also wanted to make sure that people know about your blog spot where they can find other touring dates to see you talk about your book that just came out.
Frackstock's going to be really a super event. I'm very excited about that. We're trying to bring music, science, art, all sorts of other things into the book tour, and it's happening, and it's going really well. Yeah, petroleum-238.blogspot. I've got a list of all the events. I'll be in Colorado later this year, eventually in California. And you can buy the book so easily. Not a lot of people aren't into Amazon. Some people are. It's really easy right there on Amazon. Petroleum-238, Big Oil's Dangerous Secret, and the Grassroots Fight to Stop It. Bookshop.org. Barnes & Noble has it too. We're trying to get it into big Barnes & Noble stores so we can have events there, because in some communities that's the only bookstore. And then, of course, the best way, I would say, go to your local independent bookstore. If they don't carry it, they can order it and try and get them to carry it, because they should.
Absolutely. Justin, is there anybody else you'd like to plug before we wrap the episode?
I'd like to thank, Anton, the groups like CORE, Concerned Ohio River Residents, Ohio Valley Allies, and Joe Hunkler, Buckeye Environmental Network. These grassroots groups on the ground they're the front lines of investigative journalism. People like Dr. Yuri Gorby, this sort of wonderful mad scientist character, who goes around with me, often and studies and tests things. And I say mad in the best sense of the word, because the regulatory system has failed us, we have sort of created our own sleuth, Scooby-Doo team of regulators. And we go around with the Geiger counters and the sampling bags, and we're solving this stuff. And groups, like yours and others are doing that. And that network is really what enabled this book to be. So thank you.
I also just want to shout out my old boss, Teresa Mills, somebody that you dedicated in the book. I think you said something like self-taught environmental badass and steward of the earth, or something along those lines. So thank you for shouting her out in the dedications.
Yeah, one of the first people to help inform me on this issue, and a wonderful human. Yeah, thank you for mentioning Teresa.
Well, Justin, I have one more order of business before I tell the viewers how to stay in touch with us. I bought this book at the second Athens, Ohio event that Ben organized, Roxanne Groff organized. I was curious if you'd sign my copy.
Of course, Anton. Yeah. You spilled coffee on it.
I did. It's already got some character.
No, that's how I usually, I intentionally spill things on my books. Okay. I like to do the date. And,
thank you.
You know, we're on air, so a message might take too long, but I'm just going to do what comes to my head.
Thank you.
Jeez. Dear Anton, keep up the creative and courageous fight. Thank you, Anton.
I appreciate it. Justin, I look up to you so much. You're a dear friend. I'm excited to do more events with you around the state. I think we're going to have Ashtabula and Coshocton getting planned here shortly.
Yeah.
So we're going to have you back in the state, and I'll be hanging out with you at the farm party tomorrow, too.
It's going to be a blast. Emmonsville, yeah. It's on the blog spot if anyone wants to come.
Well, Justin, thank you so much for talking all things green with me. I'm going to let our viewers know how they can stay in touch with us.
Okay, thank you, Anton.
If you'd like to stay connected with the show, be sure to follow us on TikTok at ATG Show. And if you'd like to rewatch full episodes, check out our YouTube channel, All Things Green Show. You can find all of our sources from today's episode in our show notes. All Things Green will be back soon. Thank you so much for being a part of the global sustainability movement.